Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Evidence for Faith, voice of Ratio Christi, the Student Apologetics Alliance. This is the show where we give you the evidence that shows that Christianity is true. Hi, I'm Keith Kendricks, and our regular co-host, Kirk Hastings, is off today, but we have a great topic and guest lined up for you today, and I'll be bringing him on in just a minute. I want to remind everybody that they should check out our website, evidenceforfaith.com. That's evidence, the number 4, faith.com. Also, the Facebook page, Evidence for Faith. And if you like podcasts, you can find our podcasts on iTunes or Double Twist. And do check out ratiochristi.org to find out more about Ratio Christi. Well, I have a quote of the week that I think is very apropos for today's topic, and it's from Galileo, who said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forgo their use." And I guess for those who are regular listeners, you know that we go by that on this show. Sense, reason, and logic are indispensable for the Christian faith. A couple other things that are indispensable, according to some statistics that lost my computer, are prayer and worship. This is from the Culture Watch. It's a website that I go to occasionally, and it's got some statistics about how Christians are different. One of them is that it shows that of Americans, half of adults pray at least daily, so that's kind of a surprise, and 90% of American adults believe in God. If you are a Christian, if you regularly attend worship services, it says here that you're more likely to volunteer and give to charity. And then couples who regularly attend worship services tend to have happier and more stable marriages. It says they invest more time in their relationships and are less likely to divorce than non-religious couples. Mothers who are religious when their children are young tend to have better relationships with their children. So moms, if you're looking for better relationship with your children, you need to become a Christian. And religious fathers are more likely to be proactively involved in their children's lives, a key factor in child's academic, emotional, and social success. So, again, just another point, one of the benefits of Christianity that we like to try and point out occasionally. Well, in absence of Kirk Hastings being on the show, we have a local guest, an apologist. It's surprising how many apologists you run into when you're broadcasting. You find out about people who are actively teaching in apologetics, and this is another gentleman who is in the South Jersey area teaching apologetics. His name is John Conforti. John, welcome to Evidence for Faith.
It's a pleasure to be here, Keith.
Well, John, I don't know if you have heard much of the podcasts or shows in the past, but we've focused on a couple of local apologists who are doing ministry in their churches, and somebody, I forget how, told me about you, that there was this apologist out there who was doing Bible studies and teaching on apologetics topics, and that's how I stumbled across your name. Mm-hmm. And so it's great to have you, another like-minded thinker on board.
Well, like you said, it's amazing how many apologists you do run into. It's really needed today in our churches, because we really need to bring up the intellectual education and the intellectual level in our churches to get answers out there for people to know.
Absolutely. And it seems, as we've promoted on this show, there are more and more answers, more and more evidence supporting Christianity, and that has produced more and more schools and seminaries that are teaching this as a body of thought, and more people interested in getting trained and getting degrees and things like that. I understand you're working on your doctorate. Is that right?
Yes, actually, I'm working on a doctorate in eschatology, and one of the reasons I'm doing that is because I think one of the fields where real solid learning in facts is woefully lacking is in the study of end times. I mean, everyone and his brother seems to have a book out there on the Antichrist or on Armageddon or something, and they're just woefully misinformed. So one of the specialties that I'm trying to aim at is toward that. But I do a lot just in general apologetics, and one of the studies that I have been doing lately is on the whole Galileo affair. And that's what I think I've come here to talk about today.
Yep, that's the topic for today. The Galileo Affair, as it's called. It's something that people who are interested in the atheist Christian debate run into a lot, because you will hear atheists talk about this. They will give it as an example of how science is in this great cosmic battle with religion, specifically Christianity. And one of the events that they will turn to in history to try to prove their point is the Galileo affair. And in fact, I think, if I remember right, back, what was it? 15 plus years ago, I think I read Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, and I think it's even in there. I think he talks about it as if it's this science versus religion thing.
Well, it's seen as one of these big watershed moments in the battle of science versus religion. This great war that seems to that has been going on since intellectual have been trying to divorce themselves from superstition, and it's simply not true. And I would like to point out right here at the beginning, before we even get into the topic, that most of what I'm going to be the facts that I'm going to be giving out today are just like my opinions or something that comes from like Bob Jones or from Jerry Falwell. I'm greatly indebted to Dr. Lawrence Principe, who's a professor of history of science and a PhD in chemistry himself from Johns Hopkins University. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins, a very well-respected secular university, and Maurice Ferentiaro, in his book, The Galileo Affair, a professor at the University of Milan, again, another secular university. So these are not, radical right-wing religious sources. I mean, this is standard, well-accepted history of this affair. It's just that it's been hijacked by, in some cases, both sides for propagandistic purposes. And, I just here try to set the record straight as to what exactly went on with Galileo in this whole incident. And I think people will be surprised.
Yeah. And so typically what you hear is an atheist will say, the church has been anti-science all along, and it's anti-science now. That's why it refuses to accept obvious truths like evolution. And as an example, they'll go back to Galileo, and they'll say that when Galileo discovered the heliocentric, or that the sun is at the center of the universe or the solar system, that he was excommunicated, that he was punished for trying to put forth this, because the church felt that the Bible said that the earth was at the center of the universe, or at the center, I guess at the center of the universe, they would claim. Mm-hmm. And so it couldn't be that something was more important than the earth. Everything was important. The earth was important, man was important, and so it had to be at the center of the universe. So this is the kind of mythology that's put out there. And then, of course, Galileo as the, cool-minded, rational scientist, just like the atheist, they'll claim.
Right, exactly.
Came along and set the record straight, and so was punished for this. So you're here to tell us today that that's not true? That's not really what happened?
Yeah. Truthfully, it had very little, if anything, to do with religion, first off. And Galileo, in many cases, made his own trouble. I mean, I hate to say it. He's well known as having had an acid tongue in many respects. but it had nothing to do with science versus religion. And truthfully, this whole story, you'll even hear going back to Copernicus, because Copernicus he was not the first one to propose this. You had two French philosophers who had over 100 years earlier had proposed that the sun might be at the center of the universe. And they had published papers on it, and they had themselves, though, said that, well, there's no way to prove it, so, there's no sense in speculating. And they didn't get into trouble. But there's been even a myth out there that Copernicus was afraid to publish his work, and he didn't publish his work until like 2 years before he died, because he was afraid that he'd be burned at the stake for it. Now, first off, I don't know how you put off publishing 2 years before you die, because how do you know when you're going to die?
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's like, okay, well, it's, folks, it's 2 years now. And if I get burned at the stake in 18 months, well, I haven't lost all that much,
Right.
How do you know that? How do you guess that? So, but that is certainly not true. It is true that Copernicus, at least 15 years before he did publish his work, was circulating all around Europe various drafts of his work, and everybody loved it. Truthfully, he was being urged by many churchmen. He himself was a churchman. His research was being funded by the Catholic Church,
right?
And they knew what he was up to.
Yeah, my understanding was that he was hesitant to publish because he believed that the scientific community would mock him. He didn't really want to be subject to the ridicule of the Aristotelian, Ptolemaic school of thought that was in charge of the peer review process at that time. And, he just didn't want to be laughed at and ridiculed.
Yes, he was up against a university establishment, and anyone who has tried to publish in anything that's unusual or whatever in the university system, even today, you run up against what is the conventional thinking in the university establishment, and so that is something that he certainly was afraid of. But he also realized, and this is something maybe that Galileo might have taken a hint from, he had no proof. He had a bunch of mathematical equations, and it worked out wonderful. Everybody actually loved his equations, they all used them. Even if they did not necessarily agree that his theory was correct, you have to remember, astronomers at this point in time were not a science unto themselves. They usually were either in the employment of astrologers or in the employment of agriculturalists, because it was very important to figure out when to do planting and stuff like this, and they judged this by the movement of the stars. And so they were functionaries. That's all they were, just mere functionaries at this point. And so if you're just a functionary and you just have to do mathematical equations, now what are you going to do? You're going to sit there and you're going to work all day and night on these Ptolemaic equations, which are incredibly complicated and difficult. Or are you going to use a much easier system developed by Copernicus, knock off at noon, and then, go, milk cows all day with your girlfriend, whatever they did in the 16th century for entertainment,
Right.
I don't know about you, but, I'm going to go spend the afternoon with my girlfriend, and everybody used his calculations. But everyone recognized, you're in the 16th century. You haven't even developed the telescope yet. How do you prove one way or the other whether the Earth or the Sun is at the center of the solar system? And Copernicus just realized, all the math works out, but there's no way to prove it. So after 15 years of everyone saying, your calculations are wonderful, please, even the Pope, do you realize the Pope, who was a trained mathematician, got Copernicus's work and offered him a job working on the calendar in Rome. Now, does that sound like someone who's going to burn him at the stake?
Right.
Okay. So no, Copernicus had no fear of, and there were many people I won't say many, there were quite a few people that actually did believe in heliocentrism before Galileo. What got Galileo into trouble, first off, there's two phases to this whole situation. 15 years before the whole big blow up, all right, Galileo got into trouble with the Inquisition.
John, you know what? I wanted to introduce you a little bit more to the audience, though. You live locally in Galloway, is that right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I go
you're
around
teaching at one of the local churches?
I do a lot of speaking at Faith Bible in Egg Harbor Township, but I speak at I'll speak at any local church. I'll even come to people's homes if they want to get a local home church or home group together. I charge nothing. I don't even ask that they pass a plate. I mean, if people want to give a donation to my ministry and my work, that's fine. But I don't do it for the money. I do it because it needs to be done. So we welcome all opportunities to share the word.
Wonderful. All right. Well, let's also kind of give the audience a little bit more background than what they typically get. A lot of times the Galileo Affair, people jump right into it. But I guess what I'd like to point out is that, the Earth being at the center of the solar system, that was pretty much decided science. I mean, since Aristotle and then Ptolemy, who lived around the 1st century, and it was pretty much just a given.
Sure, it was truthfully, even today, it is recognized as the most successful, long-lasting scientific theory in the history of science.
Right.
It was used for well over 1,000 years. It was proposed by Aristotle, as you said, back in the 5th century BC, and it was Ptolemy who lent all the mathematics to it. And so it became a genuine scientific theory, if you will, at that point. And it was settled science, as they say for evolution today. It's settled science for over 1,000 years. So why would you just because, some, crackpot Italians got an idea with a telescope, why would you just simply overturn it overnight without good, substantial proof? And that was the real nub of the argument, the real problem that they had.
Right. So, yeah, it really was it was just the way to think about things. There really wasn't any reason to think otherwise. And I know, when I do talk about this, I tell people it's not like they didn't have evidence that the sun went around the earth. One of the arguments was that if the earth were going around the sun, you could easily prove it by throwing a ball up into the air. And then the ball would land in a different location. It wouldn't come straight down. If the Earth was moving as fast as it would have had to have moved to go around the sun, that's a simple test. So you can see, that's interesting. Yeah, throw a ball up in the air. If the Earth is moving, it will move underneath the ball, and the ball will land in a different location. So there were little simple things like that, practical things you could do that to help you realize that the Earth couldn't be going around the sun. So just the argument wasn't as clear cut as we now think, because we're coming at,
because we're used to using Newtonian physics. You got to realize this is 100 years before Newton, right. And they're working off of Aristotelian physics, and they're saying whatever's at the center of the universe, that's what everything is moving toward. And so that's why they're saying the Earth must be you're exactly right. If the sun were at the center of the universe, everything would be moving toward the sun, and if you threw a ball up in the air, it would move. And yes, so their understanding of physics, while it was wrong, supported geocentrism, and so that's what that again was one. It wasn't just like they. It was, as a matter of fact, when Galileo first proposed his idea. And like I said, there were two phases to this affair. 15 years before Galileo really got into trouble, he had been called up before the Inquisition by some noisy, a very busybody little priest who tried to get him in trouble. And the Inquisition basically figured out what was going on, and they dismissed all the charges and said, don't, no big problem. But the one thing they couldn't dismiss was they weren't qualified to make a ruling on whether heliocentrism itself was a heretical idea. So they they outsourced it to a committee, which is what all big institutions do, and so they convened this panel of experts, of scientific experts, not priests or anything like that. These were scientists, and they came back with a report, and they said that this was just a silly idea based on their understanding of science. And so, you can count up how many religious objections they have in this list. Okay, first off, they said it violated common sense.
All right.
Okay, the Earth doesn't seem to move, and the sun and stars do move, right? So that seems to violate common sense. It violated 2,000 years of astronomical theory, which, they had been observing the heavens since Egypt and never saw, anything different. And it subverted the fundamental principles of Aristotelian physics, just like you said. And so there was no observational data to support it, and there was some predictive phenomena that was what was called parallax, and that had never been observed. Parallax is when a star comes in the gravitational field of the sun. You should see two stars, because the gravitational field of the sun should bend some of the rays of the light coming from the sun, and you should actually see two stars for a brief time. You should see that if the Earth were moving, but we didn't have telescopes that were sharp enough to be able to do that, and so that wouldn't be observed until the 19th century. And so they said, we don't see parallax. There's no evidence for this. And so they said that, and so what the Inquisition said at this time was that, okay, Galileo, we're going to give you a slap on the wrist. The only thing you cannot do is publicly support the heliocentric theory. All right, that's it. And he agreed to that. All right. Mm-hmm. So now, 15 years later, he decides he's going to write a book, and to try to get around, I guess, what you would say, this prohibition, he writes it in the form of a dialogue, right? And anyone who's read medieval or ancient writings will recognize this kind of format, where you have two guys discussing the topic under discussion, and then there's one guy which basically represents the audience. And he asks questions. That represents the reader. He's asking the questions. And then you have one guy who takes one side, and you have another guy who takes the other side. And defending heliocentrism is Mr. Know-it-all scientist. He is, wonderful, smart, intelligent, and he's basically representing Galileo.
Right.
On the other side is Reverend Stupido. Okay? He is like the biggest idiot on the planet, and he's representing geocentrism. And he's basically taking the church's position. And there's no question that he is, on the church's side, and he is not the brightest star in the universe. We'll put it that way, all right? Mm-hmm. And so this is somewhat, you could say, obviously lopsided. But technically, he's not defending the heliocentric theory. And he sends it to the office of the censor in Rome. Now, it passes the office of the censor. Now, when I say censor, this again is something else that people sort of get their hair on their all on end about.
Right.
And that is because we think, when we hear the word censor, we think of, getting sent to the gulag in the old USSR or something. Mm. And that is not what this was. This was basically what we would recognize more closely as peer review today. The censor, we got to remember that the church was the government. The church was the university at this time. All right?
Right.
There was no separation of church and university or church and state. And so the university establishment had an office where you would send your book, and the person in that office was responsible for making sure it got sent to the proper expert who knew what they were talking about. And so the Office of the Censor sent it to other mathematicians, sent Galileo's book to other mathematicians. They did not review it for political correctness. They did not review it for religious doctrine. They reviewed it for whether the science in it was sound. And it was. They passed it. If they had actually reviewed it for whether it was offensive to the church, they might have actually saved Galileo a whole bunch of headache, but they didn't. They reviewed it for whether his arguments were sound, and they were. The thing is actually, though, back when Galileo originally argued with the committee over the scientific proof, he thought that he had proof. He said that the tides proved that the Earth was moving.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
And
that's interesting.
Yes, and most people don't realize this. He thought that he had proof. This is why he was so defensive about this. He said the tides caused. As a matter of fact, the original title for this book, the original title was On the Tides. He was originally going to present it. So his central proof about the tides being the Earth's motion being the cause of the tides was actually supposed to be the center of this book. He eventually changed it to a dialogue on the two chief world systems. But originally he was showcasing his proof about the tides being proof of the Earth's motion. And of course we know today that he was totally wrong on that. Mm. And so that the scientists of his age were trying to tell him, look, be a little bit more cautious in your definition of proof. The tides could be caused by something other than what you think. And they were right.
Right.
It turns out that they were right.
So he must have thought that the water was somehow being left behind as the Earth moved. It was kind of sloshing to one side.
That's exactly what he said. He said it was sloshing around like water does in a bucket when you move it.
Oh.
And that's what he thought was causing the tides.
Okay.
And he also said that his observations through the telescope of the moons of Jupiter, that's a famous one. But
right.
You know what, truthfully, Bellarmino, who was another famous church astronomer, wrote him back on that proof. And he said, that there are other geocentric models that could account for that. For instance, one of the models that they had was that the Jupiter actually orbited the Sun, and the Sun with that orbited around the Earth, which would account for Galileo's observations. The point being, there are other ways that it's not conclusive. There are other ways that could account for, what you're doing. The one proof that would not be able to be explained by geocentrism would be stellar parallax, and we can't observe it. We don't have instruments sensitive enough. So why don't you just sort of hold your horse until we can do something? But Galileo wouldn't. It turns out all of the things that he had that he considered to be knockdown proofs were either really inconclusive or flat out wrong. And actually, the church was actually right in every case, in every single case down the line. And most people, if you read his book, he's wrong in every case. And so,
if you're just joining us, you are listening to Evidence for Faith, a ministry of Ratio Christi. I'm Keith Kendricks, and we're speaking with apologist John Conforti about the Galileo Affair. So, John, how is it then if, there was kind of this slap on the wrist and things like that. How is it then that we hear this story that Galileo was excommunicated and imprisoned or whatever? I don't know if he was racked or crucified or what.
Well, it actually should have been the end of it. When he published the book, it came to the attention of the Inquisition again, and it was actually a technical question. Did you violate your agreement not to defend the heliocentric system that you agreed 15 years ago? It was a technical legal question. They said yes. He tried to defend himself. He said, well, I never imagined that this was defending heliocentrism. They said, go read your own book and then come back and you tell us. And then he said, well, you know what? Actually, yeah, I can see how it could, And they said they gave him a slap on the wrist and they said, okay, go and be happy. But here's the thing: it had to be that verdict had to be approved by the Pope. Now, I neglected to mention a small important detail. Did I mention that the Pope was a personal friend of Galileo?
Yeah, no,
They'd grown up
you
together.
didn't yet.
Yep, they grew up together. They were personal friends. And when the Pope got elected, Galileo was received not once, but 6 times in 6 audiences. And I can imagine those audiences. We don't have minutes. But, can you imagine, like, if your best friend got elected Pope, you'd be in there like, say, look, I got these golden slippers. Look at this, gold slippers, I mean, I know I'd be doing that.
Right.
And so, 2 old friends, and so we do know from accounts of these conversations later on from both guys that writing this book was mentioned. And Galileo said, can I write this book? And the Pope said, sure, go ahead, write your book. And so he had the Pope's approval. But when the Pope gave that approval, he said, but I want you to include this one argument. It's my favorite argument in the world. And that is that because God is sovereign, God can do anything he wants and make it look any way that he wants it to look like. My favorite argument, all right?
Which doesn't sound like a very good argument.
Galileo did include the argument, but he includes it on the very last page. Now, he could have put it in the mouth of Mr. Intelligent Know-It-All Scientist. Does he do that? No. He could have put it as a good summary from the neutral guy who's asking the questions. He could have said, I don't know which of you guys is right, but, God is sovereign. He could have made the world look any way he wanted. That would have been a nice
Either
summary.
way. Yeah, that's right.
But he didn't do that. Where does he put the Pope's favorite argument? In the mouth of Reverend Stupido.
Right.
Okay? Do you think the Pope was really happy with this?
Right.
No, he was not. He had told all of his friends, Galileo's writing this book, and he's going to include my favorite argument and everything. He was livid. He went through the roof. As a matter of fact, he was heard yelling through. He said, I have been betrayed. Because also, Galileo had neglected to mention that he was not supposed to write on the heliocentric theory. He forgot to mention that to the Pope.
Oh.
So he got in trouble with his own inquisitors, and his favorite argument has just been, and this is a Pope that is dealing with the Protestant Reformation. He's got the 30 Years' War in his hand, and now his best friend has just made him look like an idiot in front of all of Europe. So when this slap-on-the-wrist verdict comes before him, he rips it up, sends it back, and he says, absolutely not. I want this.
Okay, well, it sounds like we lost John, our guest, so we will just continue on. Let's see, maybe he can come and Skype back in if John, our engineer, can get him back on the line, and we will try and continue.
Hello.
I
got cut off. I don't know what happened.
Okay. Well, anyway. You are back.
Yep.
And all right. As long as John the engineer says everything is okay, we'll proceed.
Yes. Anyway.
Yep. He says everything's okay. All right.
Okay.
So let's back up a little bit then.
So anyway,
we were talking about the Pope being
Galileo. I mean, can you imagine if you're at the height of your career, you have just been elected Pope, you're dealing with the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, and your best friend just made you look like an idiot in front of all of Europe, right? You don't need this, And that is really why Galileo ends up getting pilloried. Yes, he was pulled out and he was told to publicly recant. He was not tortured. He was not put in jail. He was not, there were not any limbs cut off or anything like that.
So no jail time.
No jail time. He did have to. He was under house arrest, what amounted to for the rest of his life, because he only lived 2 more years. But it was house arrest. It was not in some dark dungeon in Rome.
Gotcha.
It was and he did have to publicly recant his book, say that he did not believe in heliocentrism and everything. So he was publicly humiliated, but he had just publicly humiliated the Pope. And that's really the whole. This whole thing came down to a personal animosity, a personal insult, and the scientific establishment. It was scientifically untenable to overthrow what had been the most successful scientific theory, that there was. There was nothing religious in this, in this whole affair. This had nothing to do with the church, in biblical. In fact, there was a point in here where Galileo did say that if heliocentrism is right, we would have to reinterpret parts of the Bible, and he then presented his own interpretation, for instance, of the Joshua story, where Joshua asks God to have the sun stand still, and he said we would have to reinterpret this. And then he provides his own interpretation. And that was in a letter to, I think it was Catherine de' Medici, that he had sent that in a letter. And the Inquisition said, well, you know what, Galileo, don't go doing that. If you have proof that the sun is at the center of the universe, we will accept that, and that's fine. They even said that, that's fine. If you've got proof that convinces your colleagues at the university, that's fine. We'll accept that. But then we will do the reinterpretation of the Bible. We are theologians. You are an astronomer. We trust that you know what you're talking about when it comes to astronomy. We will do the reinterpretation of the Bible. We're the experts in that field. And, even today, you've been in academia. You don't go stepping on other people's toes. You don't go telling other experts how to do their job, right?
Right.
That's
exactly.
an absolute no-no.
Now, did that happen? Did that portion happen before he published?
Yes, that had happened.
So he was already creating, bad blood, even amongst, the scientists and the theologians.
Yes, and it happened specifically in Galileo. As a matter of fact, that was part of what prompted, that the busybody priest that originally brought him up to the Inquisition's attention. That was part of what got him into trouble. He had written this letter to one of the de' Medicis, and in it he had interpreted the Bible, had done some Bible interpretation, and this busybody priest somehow got a hold of this letter. Interestingly enough, some of the more damning phrases that were used appear only in the copy that was sent to the Inquisition. Galileo's personal copy and the copy that the de' Medici had, which were sent then subsequently to the Inquisition, didn't have these phrases in it. So then that's why the Inquisition ended up dismissing these charges, because the Inquisition said, where did this copy come from? And they said, well, from this busybody priest. You could almost see them rolling their eyes. It's like, okay, well,
that he had added it in.
Right. They're not stupid. And, there's this perception out there that, the Inquisition was this out-of-control, fire-branding, burning institution that there was no control over. This was a very well-controlled institution that, scholars are actually very surprised that when they read the records of particularly the Roman Inquisition. Now, the Spanish Inquisition, yes, there was a time, like under Torquemada, where it did get out of control. Absolutely.
Right. It depended on who it was that was in charge, basically.
Exactly. But you got to remember, the Inquisition was a European-wide institution. It wasn't just Spain, okay? And for the most part, through most of its history, it was a very civilized, orderly institution that paid attention very scrupulously to due process, to a whole the institutional regulations, etc. And and it wasn't, they weren't stupid, they weren't idiots, so when they, got a case like this, and they got, this, like I said, this busybody priest named Cucina, who submitted this thing, and they knew, he added it in, come on, they dismissed it immediately. The only thing, like I said, they weren't scientists, so they, sent it out, and they outsourced it, and, it came back, but it was the university institution that had a problem with it, because they said, Galileo, you've got no scientific proof. And that is really what it came down to. This was an issue about science, and ultimately about personal animosity. So,
now, you sometimes hear, you get the impression that the atheists are trying to dress up Galileo as the atheistic modern-day scientist, who doesn't think about God or doesn't think that God caused things. So was that true? Was Galileo a very non-religious, atheistic person?
Absolutely not. He was a very devoted Catholic, and he, in fact, that's one of the reasons why he wanted to reinterpret Scripture. He didn't think, that it wasn't. He didn't reject Scripture. When he found the proofs that he did, quote unquote, what he thought was proof, he didn't just say, "Oh, Scripture's wrong." He said that it just means that we have to look at Scripture. And when Pope John Paul II reopened this case in the 90s, they reaffirmed that truthfully Galileo's reinterpretation followed good Augustinian principles of theology. He was, actually a fairly good interpreter of Scripture, and he was, following the conventions of his time. So I wouldn't say at all that Galileo showed any signs of atheism or atheistic tendencies. If anything, he showed good Catholic interpretations, tendencies of his time.
And beliefs, yeah. So his only, it seems like his real problem was his personality. From what I understand, he was considered quite the egotist. He truly was a genius. He truly was a brilliant scientist. He was a mathematician. The astronomy and mathematics, were really integrated. As they are today, and he was a musician. He was kind of your Renaissance man.
Mm-hmm. And he did, like I said, he didn't suffer fools gladly. And he was caught in a time when science itself was changing. Science, like I said, as astronomers were functionaries at this point in time, and they were changing over from being just simple functionaries who were just there to get an answer right to beginning to try to understand how the universe worked. In a generation or two later, you would have Newton and Kepler, who would be trying to understand science as a way of understanding how the universe worked, as opposed to just getting the answer right. And so he's caught in that sort of tidal wave of change, and he's at that vanguard who wants to understand how the universe works, and he's being faced with an institution that's saying, why are you trying to figure out, well, who cares how the universe works? We just need to get the right answer.
Right. They wanted to know, for one thing, they wanted to know things like lunar eclipses, and, they wanted to know when Easter was going to be.
Right.
They wanted to know about solar eclipses and position of the planets, because astrology was actually a lot part of astronomy still in those days. So a lot of it was just trying to calculate when are things going to happen, like Easter.
Yeah, just the practical everyday issues, when do we plant our crops and stuff like that. And, so Galileo, don't sit there and try to figure out, it's because it really doesn't make a hill of beans as to which goes around which. Just give us the right answer. And so, he's faced with that institutionalized university mentality. And, there's any number of scientists and truthfully theologians who would bump into that over the centuries. This is not just a scientific issue, it's a human issue.
So, bringing it to today then, is this the kind of thing that scientists face when they are trying to advance newer theories and things like intelligent design, and having problems because the old paradigms, the old guard are kind of defending the gates?
Oh, absolutely. I can give you an excellent example of that, and that is when the Badlands in Washington State were being evaluated. There was a guy who, in the 1920s, suggested that it was caused by a huge flood that came through there subsequent to an ice age. And the Geological Institution at the time, the American Geological Survey, said absolutely not. Can't be that, because it sounds too much like the Bible. That was exactly the reason. And it took 60 years for that generation sort of to die off, for people to reevaluate this theory, and they eventually agreed. Now, today, that is the prevailing theory of how the Badlands in Washington were formed. And they finally, the American Geological Survey gave this guy, at 80 years old, gave him their highest award, a medal, for coming up with this theory. But he had to wait 60 years for this to be finally vindicated, because you run into that mentality of no, because of the prejudice against new ideas.
Very good. Well, John, it's been a pleasure having you on. You've been listening to John Conforti, a local apologist in the South Jersey area, on Evidence for Faith, a ministry of Ratio Christi. Send your comments and questions to email at evidenceforfaith.com. Join us again next week for more reasons to believe, and always remember that the best reason for being a Christian is because it's true.